Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Phil Sayer and this is part 2 in my mini-series on how to take your design systems in Figma to the next level. Last time we had a look at this case study that I've done building a hypothetical new feature in Notion, and we took the complete mess of components that were just scattered all over the canvas and organised them according to the atomic design system, which breaks everything down into atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. And so we now have all of our components organised into these 5 sections. So in this part 2, we're going to explore how to make use of Figma component variants in our design system in a couple of ways. First, to reduce manual resizing and tweaking of layers, and second, to introduce some versioning capabilities. So to set the context for what it is we'll be using component variants for, first of all, let's go back and have a look at our design. For those of you familiar with Notion as a tool, you'll be familiar with these tools that appear in the top right corner. Those are your share, the commenting, page history, adding to favorites, and then your hamburger style menu, or as some I think call this type a kebab menu, which is fun. And this button is one I added for this feature, which I just called page overview. And we won't go into this one today. We had a little look at this last time, but really I want to focus on these buttons in the top right. Now, because all I did was create a single screenshot effectively of the design, there's no real functionality going on here. So because this is a single screenshot, all of the buttons in the top right here are on or off depending on what's actually shown. So in this case, because I've got my page overview side panel showing, I have highlighted that icon, which is how it would normally look when it's selected, and these are how they look when they're deselected. Now, if you decided this is great, but I want to add some more designs, different window configurations to show maybe the comments panel, what that looks like, or the hamburger menu, what that looks like. If you wanted to go and build that out of the components, which is the best practice rather than trying to build everything out from scratch, if you went and actually had a look at our components, what you'll find is that I've kind of cheated a little bit just for the purpose of actually putting this together. So here are the icons that make up the right-hand toolbar at the top of the window. And what you'll notice is they're all the same size where they're deselected, which is great, 20 by 20, because that was the icon grid which was used to actually sketch all of these out. But this overview one is completely different. And what that means is, whilst it looks fine when you just put it on this particular design, the minute you were to start adapting these, perhaps to make the comment icon the active one and the overview one not active, you immediately have to go and do a lot of manual effort. Let me show you what I mean. So here I am in the design itself. I'm going to go and add in the components again. So here we are, here's our comments, here's our history, here's our favorites, here's our overview, and here's our dot menu. And this is a big old mess, so I'm just going to go and line these all up. This is not perfectly spaced in any way, shape or form. Don't need to worry about that too much. But here I am. I now want to make this comment one the active one. So I want to make this one selected and this one deselected. Okay, let's have a look. You can already see this is taking a bit of time, and okay, that's it. It's worked, but that was a big old mess. And all of a sudden now, if I had any kind of alignment, I need to kind of work out whether this all still lines up the way I want to, and it doesn't. A lot of messing around. Not ideal at all. There's a much better way to do this, and I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do it. One, which is how you might approach it instinctively to begin with, and the second is a less obvious, but I'll show you why is a potentially better way of doing things. So let's go back to components. and have a look at how we can sort out this mess. These are the icons that we need to work on. They all work in the same way. When they're selected, they get a little grey background with a corner radius, and when they're not selected, they just have their typical grey stroke colour. And what we're now going to do is find a way of reducing the amount of faff that we need to do whenever we want to show any one of these as toggled on or off. So the first thing we're going to do is just make all of their deselected states consistent. And the way we're going to do that is, first of all, get rid of the rectangle here. Now, the next important thing we need to do is make their frames all the same size. Let me show you why this is important. Let's use the comment icon for our example. I'm just going to come and drag it on its own just so we can kind of look at it in more detail. So what I'm first going to do is add a variant using the add variant button. And what that does is it goes and duplicates it, gives it a generic name, variant2, and gives you an opportunity to rename it. And importantly, these are variants that sit within a component called comment. So what that means is everything that's within this purple dotted bound makes up a variant. There's much more on the topic of variants, which I won't go into here, but I'll put some resources in the description that will really give you a good primer on the basics of how they work. So the first thing we're going to do is just go and rename it. So we know that we want to selected and deselected, so rather than variant2, I'm going to call this one selected. And then property 1 isn't particularly descriptive, so we'll call it state. And for this one, I'm going to call it, rather than default, let's call it deselected. And so now what you notice we have is this component called comment has a property called state, and it has two values, deselected and selected. And you can see as I hover over them, this is our deselected one, and this is our selected one. Now, unfortunately, by default, it actually puts the layers in a different order to what's shown on the canvas. So I'm just going to go and drag that one up there. Brilliant. And I'm just going to expand this a little bit so I can have a little bit more room to play with. Okay. So what we know is our selected state is going to have a grey background with some rounded corners. Now, what I'm going to do is actually use the bounds of this, the actual frame itself, to create that rectangle rather than creating it as a separate layer and then grouping everything together. It's just a bit neater. So if I just select everything that's underneath, I'm going to group them, and then I'm also going to double check that they aren't scaling. Now, by default, they scale, and unfortunately what that means is if I was to go and increase the size of the frame, it resizes everything really horribly, which we don't want. So let's not do that. I'm going to go and set them all to center. And so what that means is now it doesn't. Fantastic. And also it means that all of those layers are actually kept in the center of this frame, no matter how I resize it, which is great. So we know it was 39, oh, it was very close, 39 by 33, there we go. And we know that that has a grey background of, so I'm going to give it a fill color, and I believe it was EF. There we go. And it also had a corner radius of 3. And we need to make sure clip content is selected, and there we go. So this is now our selected state, and this is our deselected state. Brilliant. Now, at least as far as our comment icon goes, we might call that job done. But there is a small subtlety to this, and I'll show you why it's important. Let me go and actually create an instance of this. And in fact, if I just go back to the design here, let's actually go and get rid of this rectangle. And let's go and replace this now with the selected state. And nicely, you can see here we have a property called state. This one is deselected, so let's go and select selected. Now, you see what it did there? By default, when it does an instance swap, it will orient it around the top left as an origin, which means that because this is bigger than the variant that is deselected, which you remember is only 20 by 20, this one being larger, it's just gone and thrown it completely off kilter with the rest of the layers. If I went back to deselected, there you are, it's back to the alignment I had before, and if I select this selected state, it's gone and thrown it off again. So this is not an error, this is very much just how it works. And so, yes, you could just go and pop it back when you need to use the selected state. But again, manual effort, error prone, might be inconsistent. And also it means if someone came in and decided actually this needs to be deselected, now it's gone and popped it up here because again, it's using this as the origin. So this just isn't ideal, but there is a simple way to fix it. So if I pop it back to selected and I go back to the components, let's go and have a look at this again. So our selected state is 39 by 33. Our deselected state is 20 by 20. So if we want them to do a replacement when we do the instance swap without going throwing it all over the page, one thing we can do is just go in, select all of these, and I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to make them all center. I'm just going to use this drop down to do it this time. And again, I'm actually going to make it the same dimension, so 39 by 33. And I'll just line them up again. Now, that's it. I'm not actually going to go and add any other fill colors or strokes or anything. I just have two variants that are both exactly the same dimensions. And so what that means, you could probably guess, when I go back here and I choose deselected, it literally hasn't moved an inch. They're selected, grey background, deselected, no background. I appreciate the contrast isn't brilliant between the backdrop of the canvas, so actually let me go and I'm just going to darken this a little just to accentuate that. Selected, there you go, and deselected. Brilliant. So that we can apply to all of our components. And what we could do if we wanted to was say, brilliant, here's comment, nice, that works perfectly well. I'm going to go and do the same with overview. So let's go and add a variant nicely. That's already that dimension that we wanted. Okay, and I can go and call this selected, etc., and I'm going to go and add that same fill as before, and I'm just going to pick this one for simplicity. Brilliant. And then do it for star as well. Now the problem is yes, that works fine, and I can go in now and just choose selected, and do the same here, selected, and it works consistently. It's a little bit messy, but just for demonstration purposes. It's not really that neat though, because you have to go and manage all of these individual properties and the different options you have for each one across all of your icons, and they all work in the same way. So there's a better way to do it, and I'm going to show you a couple of ways. The first is to use basically various additional dimensions of a variant, and I'll show you what I mean. So if I go and just pop this back out on its own, I'm just going to call this default, and I'm just going to get rid of this. So this is kind of how it was before. Let's go and have a look at this again. So this has this property, two variants, deselected and selected. Now this is the actual name of the layer, but if you double click on it, you see actually the long form is state equals deselected, and if I double click on this one, it's called state equals selected. Now what that means is, as you might be able to guess, is that the actual raw text underneath this can be edited. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that I can go and add more variants to this same component. So what we'll do is I'll use overview as an example. So I can drag this in here. You see it goes and highlights it blue, so it's now been added to this component. I'm just going to line everything up again. And okay, at the moment it's just got the same name as it had before, but what I'm going to do now is double click on this. It's not state equals overview, it's actually state equals deselected, but the icon name is overview. So whilst there's a few different ways we can do this, the way I'm going to do it is call this state equals deselected, comma, type We can call this anything, but I'm going to say type equals overview. Enter. And you see what it's gone and done is shortened it, so deselected, comma, overview, even though it's now made up of two properties, state and type, and this particular variant is deselected and overview. And as you might be able to guess, you can't have duplicates, so I couldn't call this deselected, comma, overview. This has to be deselected and then type equals comment. Now, of course, the quicker way to do this is to use the actual UI rather than typing everything out. So what you notice now is we have comment, type is comment. We have our new property here that we created when we typed in the text here. Type equals comment, state equals deselected, and then the same thing for our overview. Type equals overview, state equals deselected. Now what that means is, for this variant we haven't yet edited, it's not happy because we haven't explicitly told it what the type property should be. And we know that it should be comment because that's what it is, it's a comment. But the state is selected. So now we have a nice set of variants, and you see it's gone and automatically renamed it for us when we made the change. And we can go and extend this out. So if I click on this plus, I can now go and create my selected variant for overview. And you see what it's done. It's now, again, unhappy because I've duplicated a component. It currently has, a variant. It currently has the same name, and you can't have that. So what we know is that this one here is actually our selected state, and now it's happy. And same thing as before, I'm going to go and add not that way, I'm going to go and add a fill. I'm just going to pick that, and then I'm going to go and give it corner radius, and there you go. We now have a single component, which we now need to rename, and we're just going to call this top right toolbar icon, because that's now what we're working with. We're working with icons that work in the same way, have the same dimensions, and they have the same properties when they're selected and deselected. And we can go and do the same for all of these other icons. We can create a grid, which has two sets of properties, where you would have type equals comment, overview, and then this would expand as you add them in to have history, star, dot menu, etc. And the state would only remain deselected or selected because you only have two kinds of states for each of those icons. Now let's go and see what this means for our design work. Here are the icons we had, and now you can see that this is selected overview, this is selected comment, and I can go and change this to deselected, and I can go and change this to deselected, and I can go change this back to selected. And now all of a sudden, all of the edits we need to make around state, we do via drop-downs, rather than going in, adding rectangles, moving things around, making sure the alignment is still correct, etc. Big, big improvement to our workflow and to the consistency we get of the interface. But there is a way we can do this that's even better. You might have noticed that we're still duplicating a lot of work. For each of these selected states, I have an independent set of settings that I need to tweak, such as the fill, the corner radius, and the reality is that there's still a chance that something could be slightly off between these, when actually the formatting between them needs to be very consistent. Now, the way we can resolve that is by organizing the variants slightly differently. And this is where I'm going to use a principle called DRY, D-R-Y, which stands for don't repeat yourself. Here we have repetition because whilst each icon is different and there's not really anything we can do to reduce the number of layers we have because they are just markedly different, we do have a bit of repetition here because each of those icons has the same formatting applied when it's selected. So what we can do is organize our variants slightly differently to reduce the amount of duplicated work we need to do. I'm going to demonstrate this using the other three icons that we haven't yet edited. So I'm just going to come and pop them over here on their own. And I'm going to leave these as they are just so that we have a comparison. So we have these three icons, star, history, dot menu, all the same frame dimensions, 20 by 20. And what we know is that these are what they look like in their deselected state. And in their selected state, they need to have this grey background. So what we can do is, instead of creating a selected state for every single one of those icons, what we can do is create a single selected component and then do an instance swap. And let me show you what that means. Now, the first thing we need to do is just create a placeholder component for this to work. And a very typical way of doing this is just with a little ellipse. So I'm just going to create a little ellipse, but importantly, I'm going to make it the same dimensions as these. So I'm going to make it, it's already constrained, I'm going to make it 20 by 20. And I'm also just going to match the fill color just so we can see. And often it's just a dot or a hollow dot, it really doesn't matter. But the important thing is it matches the instances that we were going to swap it with later. So that's step one. And the next thing we're going to do is turn this into a component. And you'll see why in a moment. So a moment is just called ellipse 11. I'm going to call this placeholder icon. I'm just going to pop this over to the side because the next thing I'm going to do is actually go and create an instance of it. There we go. And now what I'm going to do is pop this in a frame. So what I'm going to do is right click and say frame selection. And then I'm going to just check that this is centered. Won't resize, it'll center. And what that means now is I can make this frame the same dimensions as the selected version of that icon. So I'm going to make it 39 by 33. There we go. And the last thing I'm going to do is insert a rectangle to form the background of this button. So I'm just going to go and insert a rectangle directly within the frame. And I'm going to make it the same size as the frame. So it's 33. And I'm just going to position it within the frame. Brilliant. And then I'm just going to directly add the corner radius on that. There's a few different ways I could do that. I'm just going to do that for simplicity. And I just need to pop the icon itself at the top. And we also just need to adjust the fill color of this so that it matches. There we go. Brilliant. So now we have this frame with a rectangle inside it and this placeholder icon, which is an instance of a component. Now what this means is that we now have a generic selected icon. And within this, we can add a property, not a variant, but a property that allows us to show and hide that backdrop to replicate the idea of it being selected or deselected. And so what I'm going to do is select the rectangle. In fact, I'm just going to give it a better name, background. And I'm going to now turn this into a component. I'll rename it first and call it toolbar icon. Turn it into a component. And now if I go and select this background, I am going to add a property called Boolean, which will show or hide the background. And it's either true or false, hence Boolean. Now, rather than show background, I am going to change this to selected, and you'll see why in a second. So if I now create property, we now have this little pill here to show that we've created a property called selected. And what this means is that our generic icon with its backdrop can be switched on or off. So let me just show you what that means before we go any further. I'm going to go and insert that in. And so now we have this generic button, and I've just noticed as well that it unfortunately has a little background on it. So I'm just going to go and remove that. And the way to do that is it has a fill on the whole thing, which we don't want. So I'm just going to get rid of that. There we go. And it now has a little toggle, which at the moment is selected. And if I toggle it off, it hides that backdrop. You remember it was a toggle on the visibility of that background. I can select it on and off to show whether it's selected or deselected. And just like these icons, you're starting to get an idea, hopefully, that what we've created here is a very generic icon that can be turned on or off. And the last thing to do now is to basically rebuild this using our generic icon component. But the first thing we need to do to make our life a little easier is to go and create an instance swap property. And this is why I created this very, very simple ellipse as a component. Now, if I go and select that, and in the same way that for our background, we have a layer visibility Boolean property, I can go and create not a Boolean property, but an instance swap property for the icon. So if I click on this, and I'm going to call it icon type, and I can actually go and add some preferred values. And what this means is that rather than allowing the user, maybe it's myself, maybe it's someone else in my team, to basically replace it with anything that's already a component, some of which might just not be suitable, like these traffic lights, your window outline, you wouldn't want to replace it with that at all. I'm only going to select the icons which I know are eligible for that. And those include the hamburger history placeholder icon. I'm not going to add that grid of variants that we created earlier because it won't work for this demo. I'm just going to leave it to this list. And so if I now go and create that property, I can see now that I've got another little pill for the instance swap. And so what we now have is a toolbar icon with two properties, selected, deselected, and now I can go and swap in whatever icon I like. And because they were all the same dimensions, they all just slot neatly. There's no repositioning that needs to happen. And so what this means is I can now go and very quickly create a whole row of icons that have within them the selected and deselected state built in. So you see, I didn't need to go and do it for every one of these icons. I only had to do it for one generic placeholder, which I could then replace with whatever icon I liked, specifically those that I added to my preferred list. And I can go in and find any other component that I want to replace it with, but I won't. So let me get rid of that. And so now what we have is two different ways of creating components that can have different states and which you can then swap, in this case with a different kind of variant, or in this case using the properties that we created to change the icon that's there and then switch the background on or off to show selected or deselected. And what you can also see is that there's less duplication of design work needed for this second method than with this first method. And just to put them side by side, what you have is, in this second case, a set of icons and your placeholder icon, and you also have a second component where you can swap them in and out. So, to wrap up, please do leave your thoughts and feedback. I'm really keen to hear if this was useful to you, and I'll see you next time.